Hello and welcome back to Stones That Speak. Today I want to take you on a little bit of a journey that I've been going on in my mind since I recorded the last video. Now the last video was about the forms and it was a response to another video, and in that video I was trying to make a point about a way to conceptualize the forms as Plato talks about them, and I pulled a passage about the forms out of the dialogue that Plato wrote called the Cratylus. And I wasn't really treating the whole of the Cratylus, but because I was looking at that, I started to think about what Plato was saying in the Cratylus, and it was really, really interesting to me to dig into the way that Plato, in this sense, converges with a lot of other thought patterns. There was a comment to the previous video that was very in-depth, and I'm not 100% sure I understand it, but they pointed out that there are some people who kind of think, well, Plato must be joking with this dialogue, because what he has Socrates doing is going through essentially etymologies of Greek words and showing that there is a fundamental truth that is grounded into the words of language. That there are true words that if you trace these words back to their roots, you will find that there is something fundamental, elemental about them, that it goes beyond the mere arbitrary nature that you might think language has. There is a modern sense that, well, words can be anything, names can be anything, it doesn't matter. It's all just sounds, and then we attach the sounds to an idea, and boom, bang, there we go. That's all there is. We're done with sort of exploring any further. Yeah, sure, words evolve from other words, but it was all ultimately, like, if you trace it all back, it's just sort of made up. And Plato's saying, no. No. If you trace the words back, you'll find that there is fundamental truth in the structure of the words themselves. And of course, that got me thinking about, well, lots of things. I guess the first one I would mention is Owen Barfield. My introduction to Owen Barfield, before I really was interacting with much of these kinds of ideas at all. And this may honestly have been sort of the thing that put me on the path that I am on now, where I'm talking about this stuff and digging and trying to understand. I found a book called History in English Words in Barnes & Noble, like 15 years ago. Okay, I was 20-something. I just picked this book up, and I'm a word nerd, right? I was a writer for a while, and it didn't go so well, but I was very much interested in language, and so this book, History in English Words, talking about tracing history back through etymology, well, that really piqued my interest, and so I picked this book up and I read it, and it just blew my mind what Owen Barfield was doing with etymology, because Owen Barfield in History in English Words, if I've understood him correctly, is making basically the same point that Shakespeare makes. Not Shakespeare, although we're going to get to him. Plato is what I meant to say. He's making the same point that Plato makes, that if you trace these words back and back and back, they get a trueness to them. A more fundamental nature starts to emerge that is not apparent when you're just using them every day and not thinking about them. I'm reminded of John Vervaeke's very simple example where he talks about understanding. That to understand something, the structure of that word literally means to stand under. You have to stand and you have to be under the thing to understand it. Owen Barfield takes many words, right? And he goes back into language and he shows how that language, and I think his general premise is that all languages are on this trajectory, but he makes it specifically about English because he's an English guy and he knows more about English language, that language is emerging from something. It's emerging from something really raw and fundamental. And there's sort of fewer and fewer words as you go by, and the words apply to more and more things. And there's these interesting tipping points in languages. That this one really stuck with me at the time because he talked about Shakespeare and how that Shakespeare, he lined up Shakespeare and Homer and said that Shakespeare and Homer were both at the correct point in their language where you had enough words to create deep, deep poetry, right? You could have this interplay, and yet the language hadn't solidified yet. So if you think about at the very, very beginning, you have one word. I know. That's like just a little aside for those of you who are Jesus people with me. Well, let's say at the very beginning you have one word, but that word becomes more than one word. And you can look in the Bible, in the early Genesis parts, and you can see ruah, right? This word that means wind and breath and spirit at the same time. It's all one. Wind and breath and spirit are all one. All right? And you might imagine going back further that word becomes one with something else that encompasses even more things, and go back and further and more. Like again, there's the initial word that encompasses all meaning, and of course it must break apart. It must become many. It must fragment into reality, and so it comes down into these many words that we have. And as language progresses, you go from the idea that you have many ideas contained in one word, not in the one word, but the idea of spirit and wind and breath, right? And then you progress out into, we have all singular individual words for everything. We have wind, we have breath, we have spirit. We can differentiate those two. And Owen Barfield's, one of his assertions in History and English Words is that there is a point in language where there's enough differentiation that you have variety to use, and yet enough unity that the layers of self-referentialness, right, that the words pointing back to other meanings, the numbers of possible double meanings, if you will, are great enough that you have the perfect point where a poet can create. Owen Barfield's assertion is that Shakespeare lived at that point, not to diminish Shakespeare's skill, okay, but just to say that the man of great skill came forth also in the right time where the language was being shaped in this way, and he was able to create a really great work of literature. I will also put in a plug for another great work of literature created at that time, the King James Bible. Really beautiful work of literature. Wherever you are on the sort of belief scale, the King James Bible, I would assert, is something that you should read and appreciate for its beauty alone, because it is really well put together, and it is created in that exact same time, in that time when the language is just loose enough to have this flexibility where things can mean different things, and maybe you're not sure, so you can use a word that's sort of goofy, and like we're going to use begat instead of became the son of, because, well, you know, begat has this sort of loose meaning in the word, and so that's a whole separate thing. I read a book about that, just the word begat and the concept of begetting in the Bible, and the possibility of gaps in the genealogies. That's definitely not the point of this video. But there's this idea, right, that language goes back to a fundamental truth that can be expressed through words. Plato has Socrates talk about that the possible earliest, most real, fundamental, true sounds were onomatopoeia. Now, you might say, well, how does that work? Well, let's let's think about a word like wolf. Okay? What does a wolf do? If we think about a wolf being kind of dog-like, what do we say dogs say? They say woof, woof. Now, I'm not an etymologist. I don't know if that's the real origin of the word wolf, but that would be the idea, that you would have some people who would say, we're going to talk about the animal that says wolf. And he's over there. There's the wolf. Watch out for the wolf. And everybody's like, oh, wolf. I don't like the wolf. All right? And so they run away, and we get the word wolf. This is Plato's idea of the origin of language. And again, if we go back to Scripture, it lines up also, and not just in the Bible, by the way. There are other creation myths. If you're sort of allergic to Christianity, understand, I mean, that's my background, but also understand that this is not exclusive to Christianity. The idea that there was a fundamentally true act of naming that took place at the beginning of humanity, that one of the first acts that man undertook was to name things. That is a broad idea. It is not... It is sort of most commonly seen in the Bible when Adam names the animals, and he names Eve. And God names things before Adam. He calls things day and night, and seas and lands. Right? Those are super important to understand, that there is this differentiation going on, and that the naming is this fundamental thing. But Cratylus, it was so fascinating to see that Plato's pointing back to this idea. And because we're living when we're living, this idea of the fundamental realness of words triggered a memory that I had. Now, this was from several years back, and I could not find the original source for this person saying this. So I'm going to tell you someone said something on a podcast. You're going to have to trust me that I'm not lying to you. I'm talking about Yom Tov Glaser. Yom Tov Glaser, really, really interesting podcaster. He is a Kabbalist Jew who is teaching the Torah and the Kabbalah as a personal growth mechanism, let's say, and also as to people generally and to Jews in particular. So he has a lot of stuff about Jewishness. Can't say that word, it's difficult, but he has a lot of really good stuff about being Jewish and Jewish traditions and why they matter and what they mean to him. And he also talks about the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is the sort of medieval developed interpretation of Torah. The Torah is the Jewish scriptures. Mostly the first 5 books of the Bible, I think, is just the Torah, and then there's the Tanakh, which is the rest of I would call the Old Testament. But there's this very long tradition of these biblically inspired interpretations of what the Bible is saying, and it's not surface level interpretation. The people who do this would definitely say these things actually happened. Okay, so we're not saying that it's all just a code, but within these things that actually happened, and within the ways that they were written down, these things that actually happened, there are more truths to be gained than just to know that Joseph did a really good job saving Egypt from the famine or something. Like, yes, that's true, but there's more in there. There's a lot more in there, and I'm not a Kabbalist, although I try to be a serious student of Scripture, so I would not deign to speak more deeply than I have already about it. But it plays in somewhat similarly to how Jonathan Pageau's symbolic interpretation of Scripture and stories is done, and so Yom Tov Glaser is talking about the coronavirus, and this is early on a podcast that he recorded shortly after the lockdowns had started, I think. if I'm not mistaken. It's definitely not on YouTube anymore, by the way. You have to go to his audio-only podcast. And he was talking about the coronavirus. Now, for those of you who don't know, corona means crown. Now, why is it called the coronavirus? Let's give due to the materialist who may be watching this and really want to point out that, like, the literal, actual, physical reasons for this, and there are spikes all over this little thing, right? So you look at it and it's got like a spike going all the way around it. So you're right. You got your spikes on your crown. There's horns also. All right, we'll come back to that. The horned crown is important. Those spikes on a crown are horns. But there's this idea of the corona. He talks about, and I do have audio of this, but it's sort of scattered throughout this episode. I will link this episode to it. And this may be the episode where he talks about the rest of this that I'm going to explain, but I couldn't re-listen to the whole thing before I started the video, so I do recommend giving this guy a listen. He's really interesting. He talked about the corona, right, and how who is supposed to be crowned? Who should we crown? We should crown God. God is the one who needs to be crowned. We offer up the crown to him. That is the function of humanity, to take a crown and offer it up to God. What does humanity do? Humanity fails to take the crown and offer it up to God. What is a crown? It's glory, right? We're offering glory up to God. We do. Again, for the materialist out there, if you think he's talking about building an actual golden crown and then holding it up in the air and waiting for a heavenly hand to reach down and like, boink, thanks for the crown. Okay. Not what is going on. I mean, that is what a crown really is. Okay, when people make a crown, they are making glory in a physical, visible sense. But don't be stupid about how we're talking about this. So a crown is glory. What's the other name for the virus? It's COVID. What's the Jewish Hebrew word for glory? Kavod. You think you're going to get away from talking about the crown by calling it COVID, but you're not, because you're still going back to kavod, the weighty glory of God. It needs to be offered up. And so there's this great parallel, and I think about the book of Habakkuk in this too, because Habakkuk really, especially in chapter 2, talks about the problem of glory, that man wants glory for himself, right? And so it talks about all the ways that man tries to get glory. He heaps riches to himself. He becomes drunken, right? There's sort of the glory of like, oh, I'm drunk now. Everything's great, right? The glory of building idols. Right? And all of these glories are insufficient. All of these glories end up dragging you down. The glory is turned into shame when you heap it to yourself. There's speaking back about the King James Bible again, one of the ways that one of the phrases is translated in Habakkuk is, it talks about heaping the riches of your conquered people to yourself like thick clay. You're like adding to your body with all of this stuff that you've taken. Not your literal body, although that's another way too. People eat and eat and eat. I have this experience of glory. Well, what do? You get fat. All right? And then you're ashamed. You're ashamed because you're fat, because you ate too much, because you were trying to consume too much of God's glory. I hope this isn't too abstract. I've thought about a lot of this stuff for a long time, so it's just sort of doink, 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 hopping spots for me. But all of this stuff comes about, right? What happens? The world fundamentally fails to give glory to God for long enough, and so the glory that we desire for ourselves is manifested in this disease that, turns to death, turns to a curse, right? We're still, even though things are less locked down where I'm at, and I'm very thankful for that, there's still many shortages and things that are all off the rails because of this little glory. God said, you want the crown? Do you want the crown, guys? Here you go. I'll give you the crown. Here's the corona. And we're dealing with it, right? We haven't learned our lesson either, by the way, unfortunately. So, following all of that through from the Cratylus, I came to another interesting thing. So I was trying to find this video with Yom Tov Glacier where he talks about the corona and the crown and the kavod and the glory and the COVID, and I couldn't find it. And I'm like Googling, YouTube searching furiously, and of course YouTube is like, don't look at the COVID misinformation, please, you'll die. Okay. So they're not doing so hot with some of that. They're trying to autocorrect kavod to COVID. They really don't want God to get the glory. This is a joke a little bit. But I found a video from another guy, a different Kabbalist, who was saying the same thing, and he went in a direction that I was just not expecting. And I'm going to share that with you now. So give me a second, I'll put that up. Alright, so I have this guy's video up. Just as a heads up, I'm dropping you in a little bit further back or further forward. I'm actually not sure where it is that this intersects, but he's going back to talking about Adam and Eve naming the animals, and I thought this was really fascinating because this intersects again with all of these ideas that we've been talking about. So let's take a listen to that.
So when Adam was first commanded in the garden to give names to all the animals, and by the way, Eve was there with him at the time, inside him, they were still one. According to the linear reading of the Torah, they were still one. They were hermaphrodite when Adam and Eve got the command to call the names of the creatures. And what they were calling those names, they were extracting the essence of every being in Hebrew letters. So those Hebrew letters are conduits of living power. They're not just static ideas on a page. So
again, going back to, and the idea of Hebrew as the original language is, let's say, less in vogue etymologically now than it used to be. But I was just reading yesterday in Jubilees, which is a great extra biblical text if you want to understand the way a lot of biblical writers were thinking about things. You actually get some interesting things that, like, phrases that are used in the New Testament where you're like, oh, that's where that came from. Very interesting. So, and it's just fun, right? You don't have to necessarily like buy into all the stories, but it's very much like, well, okay, there's these gaps in Genesis and we're going to fill them in. And one of the things they talk about is that Abraham, when he's called by God, so God calls Abraham, and he's coming in response, honestly. The extra biblical stuff on Abraham is really great, too. He has a cool thing where there's like a bunch of birds that are coming to steal all the seeds out of the ground. You symbolism, guys. Again, you go crazy with that one. And Abraham, at a certain point, after he realizes that he should serve the one true God of heaven and not all the many idols, is able to rebuke the birds and send them away. And after this, God teaches to Abraham the Hebrew tongue. So in the conception that Jubilees has, the Hebrew tongue has been lost. I have an invader. I gotta see what that's about. Okay, I'm back. I had an interruption. My 7-year-old who's doing his homework inside had to tell me that the AVG expired, antivirus has expired, and now we can get viruses. So, very important news there. But so you going back to this idea that the Hebrew is some kind of fundamental language. Jubilees talks about it, right? He says they say that it's essentially there at the beginning, fragments into the other, like it disappears at Babel. The other languages fragment out, and Hebrew is lost. And then God teaches it to Abraham again once Abraham starts following him. You can do with that whatever you want. This is not a lesson about, this is what actually happened and had to be. But, like, it's a fun idea. And so here he's talking about the fundamental truth of these words in Hebrew, which is basically what we've been talking about this whole time.
When we take that approach to understanding naming and understand that counting is a part of naming, we can understand a little bit more how important counting is.
All right. I want you to think with me here, because he's just made a jump here. He's just made a jump from naming to counting, right? We have naming and we have counting, and we would probably think that these are two separate things. However, if you think about it, counting isn't possible without naming, because the numbers, let's say, in themselves aren't useful to you unless you can say their names. A 3-year-old cannot count how many pennies he has until he can say out loud, or potentially write them out if, it doesn't have to be related to speech, but you have to have the names 1 and 2 and 3. These are identifiers for numbers. The numbers themselves have to have identifiers to even be useful. And then you can take them and you can put them on something else. You can put the number out onto another thing. I can say I have 1 wristwatch here. I have 1 coffee cup with water in it. So it's just a cup. I don't have 2 of anything in here, so I can't do 2. Here, no, that's not 2. I thought it was 2. It's just folded over. But you can understand that idea, that once you have the names for the numbers, then the numbers can be names for other things. In what way? Well, probably you have an identifying number. You have a social security number if you live in America. I would bet most other countries have some kind of tracking numbers for their citizens. Everybody who's born gets a number. Didn't used to be that way, but we live in a world now where we have to have all of the kavod, all of the corona for ourselves. Well, he's going to talk more about that. Let's let him continue, because he'll say it better than I can.
Now, when you count something, you can disregard its name. That's Joe and Bob and Moshe, etc., etc. There's 10 guys here. Let's have a minion. I'm no longer interested in Bob and Joe and Moshe. I'm interested in my minion. I need those 10 guys so I can pray, say Kaddish. That's a good thing. It's a Torah thing. But you see what happens when you take a person from his name, his essence, and put him in a numbered category? You reduce him. You diminish him a tiny bit. But that tiny bit is an opening to din. Again, the act of counting is measuring, and that's din.
Just as a refresher, because you didn't see the beginning of the video, din is the word he uses for judgment, right? When you count something, you're passing judgment on it. And he's going to talk, I think, later on in the video about how that's the system of the world that we live in, right? When you go on Twitter, you tweet something and you want to know how many retweets did it get? How many likes did it get? You see a tweet that you didn't like. Are there more replies than retweets? It's been ratioed. We count it. How many people are subscribed to my YouTube channel? How many people will watch this video? How many kids do you have? How many kids do I have? How many rooms in your house, right? All of these things are acts of judgment. How much money do you have in your bank account? It's more than mine. I'm diminished. I have more money than yours. Now I'm inflated. The soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but that's what we're looking to do all the time. All of this counting, all of this numbering, endlessly numbering, counting, that's what we're participating in.
When I say, if I measure my child's height, I'm putting a number on his height. Why? Well, because I want to see how he's growing. Why? Well, because I want to see if he's healthy. Well, okay, that's a legitimate thing for a parent to want to know. Or maybe I want to know if he's going to be tall enough for the NBA. I don't know. But as parents, we know, right? And we have to be careful. If I tell my kid to get on the scale and tell him he's overweight, he's going to have a complex that he's fat. It's not necessarily fat. But putting them on the scale puts an act of din on the child's psyche. And if I call you by a number, I'm putting you down.
I'm just gonna pause here and say I've been dieting recently. Well, I haven't been. I've been thankful to be able to lose weight due to a change in my eating habits recently, and you better believe I'm judging myself. I lift myself up when I see that number go down. Boy, oh boy, I'm getting closer to 185 every day. I only got 11 more pounds to go, baby. But where it is, there's the pride. There comes up the pride. There comes up the kavod. I'm going to put a crown on my head because look what I did. Watch out.
And that's exactly why the Nazis put numbers on people's arms. Why did they need to go to that trouble? Why was it important? For that matter, why is it important? If I go to the conference of mayors, I show up, oh, my city has 10,000 people. The other guy says, 10,000, that's nothing. I'm the mayor of 100,000. And the next mayor shows up, oh, I'm the mayor of 1,000,000. It becomes an ego trip. And that's the din, again. Okay, and so on it goes. Now, what's the part of the problem, it's not just people's egos, that they use numbers for egos. They use numbers to influence. If I tell you my book has sold 1,000 copies, you say, oh, that's nice, Avraham. And if I say 1,000,000 copies, you say, wow, it must be special. So again, numbers are used to manipulate. Another aspect of din. And who are we manipulating? We're manipulating creatures that were created by God. You better have a real good, holy reason to manipulate somebody, because you're manipulating God's creations. Who gives you that right? Who gives you that power? The Torah says you don't have that right. You don't have that power to count human beings.
I just wanted to stop here and let that soak in, to really think about what he's saying, that there's I fear that we have lost this. Right? He's talking about, and later on in the video he'll talk about as well, the importance of the individual human. The fact that every human person was made in the image of God. That's a truth that's so big, it's kind of scary. Like I hear people who say that, who talk about oh, we need to honor people because they're imagers of God. And I do not put that down. Please don't misunderstand me. But it's to think about the fact that the idols that God has in the world, right? The way that you can interact with him, right? The way that the pagans interacted with their gods, right, was to come to an image of that God that they had made out of stone or wood or gold or silver and bow down to that image. But the way that you're supposed to interact with God is to interact with others in the correct way, in the way that the pagan would interact with the idol in the correct way. Not that the idol is the God. Even the pagan understands that the idol is a representation. But you better treat that idol right. You better give it the right stuff. You better bow down at the right time. People are important. They're not just numbers. I'm going to let him continue. But, wow.
And if you do, oy vavoy, just like King David, the greatest of the great. He brought on a plague that cost maybe more than 100,000 lives.
And this is a Bible story. It's one of those Bible stories where you read it and you're like, what is going on? All right? For those of you who aren't pretty familiar with the Bible, you may not have heard of this. Or maybe you've heard of it of like the, look at how dumb God was back in Bible days. Alright? David goes to count the people. He wants to know how many people he has in his kingdom. And he gets pushback, by the way. There's like the bad guy of David's story, Joab, right? Who's a pretty big douchebag in a lot of cases. Even he's like, David, this is not a good idea. Doesn't matter how many we have. We have enough. You're the king. You're in charge of a bunch of stuff. You have enough. Don't go count them. And David says, no, we're going to go count. We're going to know how many we have. And Joab goes and does as he says. And there's a plague, a pestilence that kills many, many people in Israel. All right? What was David doing? David was taking the corona from God to himself. But the corona will kill you. It will kill your people. It's tough for moderns to think about this. We have, I think, if I said to you, God will punish you for smoking cigarettes by giving you lung cancer, you would kind of understand that. You will say, well, you'll get lung cancer if you smoke enough cigarettes, probably, and then some people don't, right? And we can say like, well, God had mercy on them. It's still not a good idea to smoke a bunch of cigarettes. God will curse you for being a glutton by giving you heart disease and type 2 diabetes. And the materialist would say, well, okay. I mean, like, you will get type 2 diabetes and heart disease and a bunch of other problems if you're eating too much and you gain weight, and, that's a problem that a lot of people have. So, you have this, like, implicit understanding of this, but then all of a sudden David numbers the people and a bunch of people start dying. You're like, whoa, I don't understand that linkage. But the linkage, just because you can't see it, just because it's spiritual, just because it's in the world of meaning, it doesn't mean it's not real. I'm going to let him continue talking about this.
And certainly all the people that survived weren't too happy afterwards either. So understand how far this goes. We are not allowed to count people because they carry God's name, if they're Jews especially. And any human being is a child of God. How many likes did you get? How many hits did you get? Etc., etc. You see how far we can take this.
And now you can see that I've stolen from him already, and he talks further into the video about this idea of counting and its problem. But it also transfers over right into Jonathan Peugeot. I don't think I'm going to play the clip here, but he has a series of videos about the mark of Cain and the mark of the beast, this idea of 666, right? What is the 6? The sixth day of creation being the day when all of the physical stuff was completed. Alright? So it's full. The creation is filled up on the 6th day. There's nothing else to add. So we're done, right? Creation is done. Anyway, let's move on and hear about this. Wait, what? A 7th day? Where God rests? He just kind of sits down in the place that he made and enjoys it? And receives his crown from it? Why is that there? That 7th day. That Sabbath. Isn't that interesting? But what does the beast do? It fills everything up in the physical and then forgets the rest. There is no 7th day, right? I work at Walmart. I can tell you, I don't work on Sunday, all right? And if I was Jewish, I wouldn't work on Saturday, all right? I'm not. I would like to say it's a similar idea, but I am ashamed to admit I do not take it as seriously as many of these very intelligent Jewish people that I listen to, even though I don't, their faith exceeds mine in some ways, and I am shamed by that. But I do not work on Sunday. But you know who's open on Sunday? The place where I work, Walmart's open on Sunday. The gas station's open on Sunday. McDonald's is open on Sunday. The Sabbath, whichever day you want to pick, right? I don't necessarily, I don't want to pick sides or like go into the rabbit trail of which one's the correct one and get in a fight with a Seventh-day Adventist or with any Jews out there. The larger point is, there's never a rest. You don't ever take a rest. Every day is the same. Every day you're open. Everybody has their number. Everybody, you better be counted. But if you got born, we better find you, hunt you down, and slap a social security number on you because you need to be part of the system. The system will be total. Everyone will be counted. I make fishing licenses for people every day, and it bugs me so much that people are really happy with that system. They're just fine. And I say it bugs me so much. I understand. People don't have the time to think about these things, and they're not going to think about them in the way I'm thinking about them. But you sit there and you put in your driver's license number and your social security number and your address and your phone number, and what do they give you? If you haven't been in the system before, they're going to give you a new customer number. You're already in the database of the Social Security Administration. You're already in the Florida database of being a driver's license holder, so you're already counted twice. You're already in the cell phone database, so they've counted you, and now you've got another number slapped on you so you can fish. Now, I'm not against the idea of getting fishermen to help pay for what they do and to limit how many fish are caught. You know, I think all of those conservation efforts are good in a certain sense. At least the impulse behind them is good. I'm not an anarchist, but I see how it's all part of the system, how it's all part of the totalizing that we have not learned, right? We got hit with the Sabbath of COVID. Right? COVID made everybody, well, at least it tried to make everybody rest. That's what the idea of the shutdown was, where everybody's going to take 2 weeks of Sabbath. And we're going to rest, and we're not going to go buy things, and we're not going to go and interact with our friends and our families, and we're just going to be shut up. Right? And then, of course, they tried to lengthen it. I'm not even going to get it. This is about COVID, but it's not about COVID. But the Sabbath will come for you. If you don't take it, this is also in the Bible, but it's also true. If you refuse to sleep for long enough, eventually you will just pass out. And it may not be during the time that you want to pass out. If you refuse to take your day of rest for long enough, you will be forced to take some days of rest. And on it goes. I actually just read this in Leviticus recently about the Jubilees and the weeks of years and how every 7th year you're supposed to rest. You have to take that rest for the land, or the land will rest for you. And it may rest for longer than you want. Now, I realize that we took a journey here, and the ending connection to the beginning is a little bit tenuous, but I didn't know how else to really bring out all these ideas together. So I hope it wasn't too confusing. I hope it wasn't too weird to go from talking about these ideas of fundamental naming over to naming and coronavirus, and how that counting plays into that, and how ultimately all of this stuff falls down on our heads if we do too much of it. If we do too much counting, if we take too much of this filling up without the rest, without the space for God, it'll snap back eventually. And I fear we haven't learned our lesson. That's all I have for today. Appreciate you guys listening, paying attention. If you have a comment and want to inform me about anything, or have further thoughts, like I said, this was partially inspired by a comment on the previous video. Got like 4 views. I counted them. Guess what? That's cool. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the comment that the person left, and like I said, I didn't fully understand it, but it got me thinking a lot. And I hope that we've helped you to think today as well. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.